All right, we're going to talk about the Mayans and the Mayan calendar system. Back in 2012, there was a lot of hype because there were people claiming that the world was going to end, and they based this justification on the Mayan calendars. And at the time, I was asked if I would give a talk on it. So I gave a talk open to anybody that wanted to come to it on the campus. In fact, I gave it several different times, and even at different schools where they asked me to come speak about it. Just because this is kind of stuff that I'm interested in, and I wanted to explain the actual facts behind what all these wild claims were. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about here. Is we're going to talk about the calendars, the Mayan calendars. Because the Mayans used a complicated system, much more complicated than our calendar system. It actually has 3 different types of calendars, the Mayans did, running simultaneously, which is very confusing. What we do is we use the Gregorian calendar. That's our date. So I wrote this originally back in 2008. So March 13th, 2008, Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar that we use. It was named after Pope Gregory that wanted to update the calendar that they were using. Before that, they were using the Julian calendar based on Julius Caesar, or named after Julius Caesar, to correct for the date when they were trying to figure out when Jesus Christ had died. And so Pope Gregory was having his people count backwards to try to figure out the exact date and to reset the calendar because they know that it didn't match it after that time. That's the current calendar we're using it now, which means we have leap years every 4 years, but every 100 years that's divided by 400, we don't have a leap year when we should have a leap year. That's to take into the fact that a year is actually 365, like 0.249 some days, and those extra days add up over time, and so it corrects for that. All right, but in Mayan, this is the Mayan calendar. Notice it's a series of numbers. We call this their long count calendar, and then we have 2 other ones. We have the Ha'ab or the Solkin calendars, and we'll talk about each of those in details and what they meant. So the long count calendar is this one right here. The good thing about the long count calendar, and why many people say, the long count calendar is more accurate than the one we do, is it just counts days. It doesn't worry about years. You don't worry about those quarter days. It just counts the number of days. So it's not tied to a year or to a month or any of these things that don't divide it. It just counts the number of days, so it can be very accurate. Astronomers use a similar type thing. We call it a Julian date, where we just count days. We ignore all the years and months and all that because that just makes it very confusing. Then they have the Solkin date, and they have the Ha'ab date. All right, we'll talk about those in detail. Notice, but each day, each one of these changed. So the next day, so March 14th, this would change, this would change, this would change. So all the calendars are working simultaneously. All right, we're going to talk about the Solkin calendar first. The Solkin calendar is the one that is what we would call the religious calendar. This was the one when they would figure out what days were special days. They were very, what we would now call superstitious, meaning certain days meant certain things. And they had a base 20 system. So you have a named week that goes from 0 to 19, which is a base 20 system. Like ours goes to 0 to 9, then it switches over to 10. There's a 0 to 19, then when they hit 20, they switch over to a new one. So they have a base 20 system, but to them 13 was a very special number. So they would have 13 weeks of 20 weeks. You're like, what? And they're running simultaneously. But 13 times 20 is 260. So the whole calendar was actually 260 days long. These are the 0 to 19 week names. So these are the names of each of them, if you cared, and their symbols. But we can read those. So when we saw stelas or the sides of buildings, they would put the dates on there, and we can read what date that was. All right. And the Solkin calendar is a 260-day calendar, and it's very much for the religious views. And the confusing thing about it is that both of them are running simultaneously. So this is very different than ours is month and days, right? So if we have January, we stay in January all the way up until you get to 31, then you go to February and then you count all those. That's not how the Mayans did it. The Mayans would do it where both of the two dates were running simultaneously. So it'd be kind of like having January 1st, February 2nd, March 3rd. So you're changing both the month and the day every single day. And then what that occurs is that it only synchronizes occasionally. It only synchronizes again every 260 some days later. This is a representation of it. It's kind of confusing here, but the inner one here is the 13 that rolls on the 20. So every day this rolls once, and this is the longer calendar out here, and so that you would get a different date every time around. Because of that, it would make it very significant to them when the dates would line up. So every 260 days, you would only get 1 2 mulak when it would line up at exactly on that date. And that might be a special day for doing your laundry or planting crops or something. And so those days became very significant to them, whatever that date was. Okay, now a lot of speculations why 260 days. We know 260 days is very important to them, and that 260-day calendar we see in the Mayans is also exactly the same as the Aztecs, which makes total sense because remember the Aztecs took most of the Mayan stuff and just kind of changed it around and made it their own. And the 260-day calendar may even predate the Mayan people and go back to an older people before that the Mayans adopted into their system. One of the reasons that it could be 260 days is because we talked about this, is at a latitude of 15 degrees north, which is right about the middle of the Mayan kingdom, you know, that the zenith, the sun would go up. Remember, sun on the summer solstice comes down to here. It crosses the zenith. So then it goes past the zenith because you're closer to the tropics. You're within the tropics. You're less than 23.5 degrees north. And so the sun, to go all the way down here to winter solstice and then back up again, takes exactly 260 days if you live at 15 degrees north. Possible. Remember, it's 260, but then to go this way and come back is only going to be 105 days, so you get your total 365 days. All right. Some also suggested that 260 days is very close to the gestation period in humans. We usually talk about it as 9 months with 9 times 30, which is 270 days. But there is evidence that our gestation period now is slightly longer than it was back then. And so 260 days might have been about the exact time for the babies to be born in humans. All right. Now the Ha'ab or Ja'ab calendar, it's both ways, is a 365-day calendar, which matters because if you need a calendar and you want a calendar to figure out when to plant crops or when the weather is going to change, it has to be synchronized to a year, to the revolution period of the Earth. And to be synchronized to the revolution period of the Earth, it has to be 365 days. In fact, not only is it 365, but every 4 years you have to add that extra day or a leap year in. We know that the Mayans already knew that and they added that extra day every 4 years. In this case, remember they like 20s, so they had 18 months of 20 days. Well, 18 times 20 is 360. Then they had a 5-day month, what they called their 19th month. It was only 5 days. On a leap year, it would be 6 days. Okay. Now, the reason their calendar worked out this way is because they were not hung up on the moon at all. In fact, they don't worry about the moon nearly as much as other cultures did. So they never tried to make a month the synodic period of the moon of 29.5 days. And so it makes things work out nicer if you have 18 months of 20 days. All right. The days of the month went from 0 to 19, which is interesting because most people don't do 0 because they say, okay, this is the first day and the second day of the month. You usually don't start with 0. Even when people count, you say count to 10, they don't say 0, 1, they just start with 1. But they actually went from 0 to 19. And so it's one of the only calendars we know that actually uses the number 0 as the beginning date. All right, what was really interesting is you start to look at the synchronicity between this is the calendar here, this is the Ha'ab calendar, these are the Tzolk'in calendars, And they would only synchronize every 52 years. So you got a 260-day calendar and a 365-day calendar. The only time they came back together was 18,980 days later, which was 52 years. So after 52 years, they would say that they completed one calendar round. And to us, that's kind of like a century. When a new century occurs, when the year 2000 occurred, everybody had big celebrations and big parties. It was a big deal because we made it to a new century. To them, this would occur every 52 years, what they called a new calendar round. And during that time, when the 52 years, when it lined up and it was time for it to reset again, that was a very special time for them. We know the Aztecs that we use in a similar calendar, during this time, they put out all the fires in the cities. Remember, they had some very large cities. And then at the temple, they'd light a fire, and then from that fire, they would light the houses, and each house would light the other houses until you had all the houses had their own fires. But it would start from a single point. It was also during that week when this occurred that they were never guaranteed that the gods were going to give them another calendar round. And so once they knew there was going to be another calendar round, there was a big celebration. And the Mayan people and the Aztec people believed everything was cyclical. There was no beginning and end. It was just a new cycle starting over again. A day was a new cycle. Every time you had a calendar round, it was a new cycle. Everything was cyclical in nature. And the other thing that was interesting is nowadays people live about 1 century. They don't quite live 100 years. The average, I think, is like 80 years. But back then, life expectancy was about 52 years. So an average human would live about 1 calendar round. All right, the Pleiades, which is this little cluster of stars, was very significant to the Mayan people. Some of them, in some beliefs, they have many different beliefs, but it was called the S'ap-ek, or the rattlesnake's tail. These are modern pictures of it. They never saw it like that. But it would have been very high in their sky, very prominent. The nice thing about the Pleiades is